My name is Jennifer Borland, and I am presenting today from Jacksonville, Florida. I had another presentation at the Association for Computing and Educational Technology down here, about an hour away from our session up there in Indianapolis, so apologize for not being able to be there in person, but I'm really excited to talk a little bit today about some of my earliest experiences with virtual field trips, and one of the first things that really got me excited in distance learning in general. Before I jump into some of the specific examples, I wanted to talk a little bit about what virtual field trips are and provide a little bit of a framing quote for our discussion today. I know there'll be a little bit of variation on this, but I like the idea of a virtual field trip being a digitally vicarious experience that allows the participant to travel through space and time, free of the constraints of real-world travel, including places, people, and events that occur naturally throughout human and natural history. And I think the example I'm going to show you here in just a few minutes is going to be representative of that concept in general. I also wanted to kind of frame the idea around why virtual field trips are something that educators would consider and have considered, and it probably comes as no shock that the cost of taking field trips in this day and age are somewhat prohibitive for some schools and for some students. The notion of time and the limited school day that makes time, the time necessary to travel to certain places challenging, and just the inability to travel back in time or potentially into the future. Virtual field trips let us do a little bit more creative things in terms of where and when we go. The dangers associated with certain field trips are just certain places that it's challenging to take students for liability reasons, and in this day and age, just things that schools and teachers are probably going to avoid if at all possible, and then obviously the red tape associated with the logistics of getting students from point A to point B. So virtual field trips really provide a shortcut or a tunnel to certain experiences without all of these potential challenges. So I want to talk a little bit about my specific experiences working with the Turner Adventure Learning Program in the mid-90s. The brochures and promotional materials for Turner claimed boldly that you could take your students to the far corners of the globe electronically and inexpensively. And it did. They had several successful field trips that really did take students all over the world. They weren't free, obviously. They were $400. They had various discounts for multiple participation in multiple field trips, but there was a fee-based structure associated with them. They were video and online resource and print resources, so it was the hybrid of different media that were coming together to provide that field trip experience. They took place over a course of 3 days consecutively. And there were different feeds for different grade levels. So there was a more advanced that was appropriate for the upper middle school and high school grades, and then a lower level that was more appropriate for elementary and early elementary aged students. And there were also different feeds for different time zones to accommodate different school days and different times that students were actually physically present in their schools. And obviously various content areas ranging from history to science and even the arts, and a little bit of media and language arts as well. The first one actually took place in Gettysburg, which isn't surprising given Ted Turner's affinity for the Battle of Gettysburg and history of the United States South. It was in 1994, so a little ways ago, and there were about 200 schools that participated, so it was a great showing for that first kickoff field trip. The field trip featured live reenactments from professional reenactment groups, so it was a very high-end production from the video standpoint as well as the content standpoint. So the Center for Excellence in Education, where I worked at the time, worked to provide the resources. So we were digitizing letters and journals and diaries as well as pictures. We also had music from the period, newspaper articles. It was a really rich set of authentic resources, and those were mailed to the schools, all 200 of them, on little floppy disks. So if you can remember old school style floppy disks, that's how they got their resources, because it was in the really early days of internet, and it was just starting to emerge that you could actually disseminate things electronically without physically mailing the content to them. Another innovative component of the Gettysburg field trip was the fact that they had placed very strategically cameras at student eye level to give students a real feel for what they were seeing, as if they were physically located there. And the field trips also allowed opportunities for real-time interaction. So they could call in with a 1-800 number, or fax a question, or use an AOL message board to type a question. The next trip took place to Okefenokee Swamp, and that was in November of 1994 as well. It provided a choice of a problem-based approach to the curriculum, where you're really kind of experimenting things and testing different hypotheses, or one that was strictly content-based, so really just kind of getting a feel for what the science associated with the swamp and the natural wildlife refuge there was. There were also multiple discussion forums that took place ahead of the trip. So one of the things they learned from Gettysburg is that there wasn't as much of the preparation ahead of time before the field trip as they had hoped. And so they strategically planned several forum discussions that would take place before the trip to Okefenokee that students and classes could engage in over a longer period of time to really build up to the experience of going to Okefenokee and really making that a more culminating experience as they had envisioned it. The other thing about Okefenokee, obviously, in addition to the natural sense of danger associated with some of the wildlife there that might make it prohibitive for some classes to take a real field trip there, there was also a natural weather emergency. There was a low-grade hurricane that took place while they were filming the field trip to Okefenokee, but it provided a really neat opportunity for them to talk about some of the meteorological sciences and weather-based sciences in addition to the natural sciences that were the target of the particular field trip in that instance. The next one was the trip to Kenya, and obviously this is a great example of something that's probably beyond the scope of what real field trips most schools could take. You're not going to be able to fly a large group of students halfway around the world for obvious reasons, not the least of which would be the cost associated with doing so. This one took place in early 1995, and this one, a little bit differently than the others, included a lot of pre-taped material. So they had the luxury of being on site for several days in Kenya and could gather lots and lots of video footage and condense that down. So the beginning of each day's broadcast was 15 minutes of pre-tape material, followed by 45 minutes rather, of live material. The live material allowed students to interact one-on-one, but the pre-taped material included highlights from the previous 24 hours, condensed down into that short period of time. They also strategized in terms of when they were placing the different feeds or planning the different feeds so that the second one could occur at dusk and carry on into the nighttime hours, and they used infrared cameras to actually capture nighttime activities, which was kind of a cool effect as well. And because they were there and taping for such a long period of time, it really gave students a chance to see things they might not have seen if they had actually been physically present in Kenya and visiting a park for an hour or two. So that was another unique advantage of that particular strategy. We found that there were, on the production side of things, several challenges with copyright. And this was about the point where there was a large shift from online, or rather physically mailed resources to online distributed resources. So we were able to provide lots and lots of links to new and emerging websites that were being created, and this is in the very early days of internet, so they weren't necessarily the most glamorous, but there were starting to be more and more resources available online, whereas we had a lot of challenge and obstacles in obtaining copyright to producing digital or reproducing digital materials to mail to schools. So I think one of the best actual physical things we could mail to the school was a National Geographic article from 1972. So it was a little bit outdated, and we had some travel brochures, but it was really difficult to get some of the more up-to-date resources. But we could point right to certain things on the internet that were available at that point in time, and that was a much more convenient way of providing that content to schools. And then the program also featured some Kenyan students that were physically located in Kenya and could interact with the students in the U.S., so that was a neat cultural learning opportunity as well. And the final field trip that I had an opportunity to work directly with was one called Working with Words and Images, and that one took place at the CNN studios, and obviously there were far less copyright issues. We had an abundance of resources that we were able both to link to and send to schools, and a really robust set of teacher education resources so that the teachers could prepare for the field trip and really support the learning that took place during that field trip in a really robust way. So obviously there were fewer challenges because we had the full cooperation of CNN, obviously, since it was a Turner production as well. The other field trips that came after the time that I had left the project were the European migration to America. That one visited Ellis Island and looked at the notion of migration and immigration, and that was in '95 as well. And we also hosted one in Indiana University in our School of Music, looking at the history associated with music, so a little bit of crossover into those two content areas, and one that went to the Los Alamos National Laboratories in New Mexico. We learned a lot of things from the experience working with Turner Adventure Learning. In addition to creating the resources, we also had opportunities to go into schools and talk with teachers and talk with students. We found that the field trips obviously helped to add depth and realism to the study, so the authentic resources and just the opportunity to interact with people in a more in-depth way during those experiences was really beneficial and seemed to have an impact on the participants. Obviously, the participation in virtual field trips was able to overcome many of the barriers that would have been in place had the schools or students tried to take those actual field trips. So traveling to Kenya or traveling to Okefenokee might have been challenging for various reasons. And we also found that training and support were really key, that in absence of training materials and a real concerted effort to provide that support for teachers, that the field trips weren't as high of a quality as they could potentially be when we were providing additional resources and support to the teachers in those endeavors. We also found that the timing of the programs, even with the multiple feeds, didn't always align well with the school day, and there were challenges associated with trying to adjust schedules so that students could physically be present for the field trips that they were hoping to take. And we also found that at least in the way that it took place in Turner, there were some challenges with interaction, and that being distracting. So if you actually had to physically walk to a fax machine to fax and wait for your answer or your question to go through, or wait to line up at a computer and type your question into the AOL forum, that it could be a distraction. You weren't watching the rest of the program, and that was something that was observed at that period of time as well. Obviously, because they were live feeds, you couldn't pause the video, and there were no DVRs back then. It could be video recorded, and the schools were given permission to video record and play back the field trips, but during the live feeds themselves, you wouldn't have that luxury of being able to pause and have a secondary dialogue with students. And then there were also some interesting discussions that took place around that idea of having in the Kenyan sense, for the Kenyan field trip, where you were condensing 24 hours down into 15 minutes, and you were really showing the top 1% or top 10% of the coolest things that had happened during that period of time, rather than really seeing what you would see if you were there on site and seeing natural animal behavior as opposed to some of the more exciting things that might happen. And there were obviously pros and cons to both, because you get kids really excited about science on one hand, and on the other you might present an unrealistic sense of what studying animals and animal behavior might be like for a real scientist. In sum, I wanted to present a set of questions, and it's my hope that we might be able to come back to these questions at the end or use these to frame the further discussion of virtual field trips as we move forward. And rather than read these, I'll just leave these up for a second as we transition, and look forward hopefully to be able to hop on with you guys at the end if you do have any questions, and would love to be a part of that conversation as well. Thanks so much, and I hope the rest of the presentation goes well. Take care.